Welcome everyone to today's event. This is one of the events we are organizing in conjunction with the Queen Mary Latin American Network and the Queen Mary University of London School of Politics and International Relations. My name is Javier Zajuria. I'm a senior lecturer at the school, and I'm really grateful for all of you for being here, even with the technical problems we had, and also to our presenters. Today we are having Cristóbal Rovira Kaltwasser, I'm going to introduce them in a second, and Julieta Suárez-Cao. Julieta, unfortunately, is having some connection issues, so we are going to try to solve them in the background as we speak. Hopefully she'll join us, otherwise we'll have to wing it the way we can work at it. Just to give you some context, the idea here is that our presenters will provide a quick presentation for no more than 10 to 15 minutes maybe about a particular topic. We have discussed them with them in advance on the situation in Chile and their thoughts about it. And then we're going to open up a Q&A. Hopefully we're going to end up within the hour. And the idea is that you can also participate as asking your own questions. You can see that there's a button at the top of your screen that's a Q&A where you can ask your own questions. We'll be looking through them, and I'll be reading them out loud and telling it to our presenters. Also, we are collecting emails for the Queen Mary Latin American Network mailing list. For GDPR purposes, we can't use your emails that you use to sign up for Eventbrite. So if you're willing to know, or you wish to know more about the activities and the events that we're having at Queen Mary, please leave your email as a Q&A. It will not be public, so only us will be able to see it. And if you leave us your email address, we can then collect it and put you into the email list. Okay, so that's all. Right, so as I said, this is a seminar called Uncertainty and Hope in Chile, Key Aspects of the New Constitutional Process. And as such, the idea is to discuss and to learn a bit more about the situation that's happening in the country, particularly since the protests started in October 2019, and the whole process that was triggered by it that ended, or maybe it was just a milestone on the 25th of October when Chile had a referendum in which 78% of the population decided to change the constitution, to write a new constitution. And more importantly, or also as important, the way in which this new constitution will be written is through a constitutional assembly, or it's called a constitutional convention, more for political reasons than by definition, which will be elected in April next year. The Chilean, to understand a bit of the Chilean context, Chile has been praised for many years, particularly since the end of the dictatorship in 1990, as one of the most stable democracies in the region, in Latin America, and also one of the most prosperous. Since the end of the dictatorship, the levels of poverty in Chile have decreased significantly, but not necessarily the levels of inequality. And therefore, unrest has been building up at least from the last 10 years, and some people could say even from the last 15 years with the student protests in 2006. There are many reasons and many different theories that can explain how this level of unrest was building up in a society that from the outside, it looks quite prosperous and stable. Now, if we want to look at different key events, and I'm doing this as a way to provide some background before our speakers, in 2006, we have student protests that were increased in 2011 during the first term of Piñera administration. That was the first right-wing administration since the dictatorship. Then in 2013, in the election process, there was a movement, a social movement called Marca tu Voto, which means that people were asked to write down in their ballots the words AC as a way to ask for a constitutional assembly, Asamblea Constituyente. According to their own counts, almost 10% of the population, or the people who voted, wrote down in their votes that they wanted a constitutional assembly. That led to a great pressure for the incoming Bachelet government, that's the second term of Michelle Bachelet, to take on this issue, and she decided to put forward a process of discussions. We call them the encuentros locales autoconvocados, or the kind of organized local meetings in which people, over 200,000 people across the country, and actually from outside the country as well, met with a clear methodology to discuss issues that were then put together into a constitutional draft. That draft was submitted to Congress only a few days before Bachelet had to leave office. So obviously, the new incoming government from Piñera didn't take any pressures on working on it. Actually, it was archived somewhere in Congress. So that is the backdrop of the protests in 2019, where on the 18th of October, after several days of protest against the rise of the price of public transportation in Santiago, different metro stations were burned, people hit the streets, and it was a chaotic scene from those of us who actually saw it from abroad. And since then, a month after, on the 15th of November, the political elites decided to trigger a constitutional process as a way to provide an institutional way out of this situation. So that is the backdrop, and that is the context of today's talk. Chile now is facing the challenge of having to write a new constitution from scratch. They only have 1 year to do it, starting from May next year. And at the moment, it's going to be 155 members of this Constitutional Assembly. Now, one of the things that is important to understand also is that this Constitutional Assembly will have gender parity. And if we manage to get Julieta on board, she can explain us more about it. So I'm going to introduce now our presenters or speakers. The first one, it's Professor Cristóbal Rovira Kaltwasser. Cristóbal is a professor at Universidad Diego Portales and is also a researcher, an associate researcher at the Center for Social Conflict and Cohesion, COES Chile, which studies social cohesion and conflict, as the name says, of course. But Cristóbal is also well known around the world for his work on populism, for his work on the far right, and also his more recent work on identity politics, or political identities, to be more specific. So we're quite grateful for him, for his time, and for his possibility of spending some minutes with us talking about the Chilean situation. Our other speaker is Dr. Julieta Suárez-Cao. She's an associate professor of political science at PUC Chile, and she's also the coordinator of the Red de Politólogas, which is the largest Spanish-speaking network of female political scientists. And also it's very important because herself, along with all the colleagues, were involved in the design of the Constitutional Assembly, Constitutional Convention, and particularly in the rules that will allow this convention to have gender parity. So that's also great to have her around. So we're going to start with Cristóbal, who I hope it's ready and his camera is on. And then we're going to move on to Julieta, and then we're going to go to the Q&A. Thank you very much, Cristóbal. The floor.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Your camera is off.
My camera? It's on.
There you go. It's working now.
Yes, now it's working. Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Javier, for the invitation to present today virtually in London. But also, I suppose that most of the people that are hearing this talk are in London and probably in the UK. So it's quite interesting to try to tell them what is going on in my own country, in Chile. So I will talk for briefly 10 minutes. And in the 10 minutes that I have, then my idea is mainly to develop a couple of ideas on what the result of the referendum, of the constitutional referendum, tell us about Chilean society at the moment and also the prospect. And I will have 4 key ideas that I want to develop. So one idea is related to the results as such, something that I will talk briefly. The second idea is about to what extent we are seeing polarization in contemporary Chilean society. And the third point is about the situation on the right-wing bloc. And my fourth point is on the situation on the left-wing bloc, the left-wing bloc. So these are the 4 key arguments that I want to develop. So let's go to the first point that I want to present or talk about. And this is about the results of the referendum. I mean, Javier mentioned briefly that we have a referendum at the end of October in which people have to decide whether they want a new constitution and whether this new constitution should be written either by a mixed assembly, so half of the people from the Congress and half of the people elected only for that purpose, or whether that constituent assembly should be only composed by people elected for drafting this new constitution. So all the polls were suggesting that probably the most progressive option will win, which means approving the changing the constitution and also the option of the Constituent Assembly. But what was very surprising, and I would say for almost everybody within Chilean society, but also from abroad, was that the result was a real landslide. Almost 80% of the population decided that Chile needs a new constitution, and almost 80% of the population decided also that they want to have this Constituent Assembly that Javier mentioned, 155 people that are going to be working for a year only for the purpose of drafting that new constitution. And if Julieta joins us, she can tell us more about how it's going to be composed, because it's a quite novel entity. As far as I know, this would be the first time in the history that we'll have an entity in which 50% of the people that were going to be there are going to be women. So, but what is interesting about that result, it's true that 80% of the Chilean population voted for that option, but a map showing the results of Santiago is quite interesting. And this is a figure, a map that started to get viral after the referendum that shows that there are 3 neighborhoods within Santiago in which the people voted against the constitutional change. And no surprise, these 3 neighborhoods are the wealthiest neighborhoods within Santiago and probably the wealthiest neighborhoods within Chile. Which means that if you ever need to teach something called class voting, this is probably the best example that you can put, because it shows that the very wealthy, the elite of the country has a completely different opinion than the rest of the population. So, and this shows something that many people have been saying for a while, that we have an elite that is completely detached from the ideas and interests of Chilean society. This represents a big challenge, something that we can talk probably later on in the Q&A for the development of the Constituent Assembly. But my feeling and my hope is that that elite, it will be divided between 2 groups. To use the words of Guillermo O'Donnell, we will see a division between the softliners and the hardliners, or if you want, the ideologues and the pragmatists. So we'll have the ideologues or the hardliners who will say we don't want to change anything, but we'll have a big chunk of the elite that it's going to be much more working like pragmatists or as softliners that would say, okay, it's time to change certain things within Chilean society, and they will try that these changes are going to be mild reforms and not structural reforms. So this is the first point that I wanted to develop, and it's related again to the electoral results and to this idea that we have an elite that is very detached from the ideas from society. The second idea that I want to talk briefly, it's about polarization. Before the referendum, there has been a lot of debate in Chilean media about the extent to which Chilean society is getting very polarized. And in fact, many academics, but I would say many journalists more than academics, have been saying, well, it has a lot of similarities with the period of the 70s, in which we had a big polarization in Chilean society between the left-wing bloc and the right-wing bloc. Nevertheless, the results of the referendum shows that Chilean society is not deeply polarized about changing the constitution. 80% of the population said that they want a new constitution. So in theory, the result shows that there is no big polarization within society, and I tend to agree with this idea. However, I do think that now we will start a new political process because Chileans will start debating about which types of society do they want, which type of social contract do we want to build. And I do think that polarization will start to grow now with the process of the Constituent Assembly. Nevertheless, I don't think that polarization is going to be a huge problem within Chilean society, but I do think that polarization will start now, because one thing is to say that we want a new constitution, but another thing is to start debating about which type of constitution do we want, or to put in other words, which type of social contract do we want to build. So in this sense, again, I think that Chilean society is not deeply polarized, but I think that polarization will start to grow slowly, but not in a radical sense, probably in a good sense, in the couple of next months after the constituent process. My last 2 points that I want to develop. The third point is about the situation of the right-wing bloc. And I do think that the electoral result of the referendum represents a huge challenge for the right-wing bloc in Chile. The reason for that, it's related to something that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation. And this is the map that I was talking about that shows that the very wealthy adopted a position that is completely different from the rest of Chilean society. And this represents a big challenge for the right, because the Chilean right, and I think this is not only a phenomenon in Chile, it's a global phenomenon, but in Chile it's probably a bit more acute than in other countries, that the right tends to represent the ideas and interests of the very wealthy. In fact, the UDI, one of the main right-wing parties of the country, so I remember that the day of the referendum, a journalist have an interview with the president of UDI, Jacqueline van Rieselberghe, and the journalist asked her what is her opinion on the electoral result. And she said, well, it's a very good result because we got 20% of the vote and we are happy about being the party of the 20%. So, but this is one option. So one option that the right has is to say, okay, we want to stick to the old model. We don't want to do any type of reforms. And this means that we are going to be the party of the 20%, which means that you will never govern, because to govern, you need more than 50% of the vote. So that's one option. The other option for the right, and this is what many political actors within the right-wing bloc are pushing, is to say that it's time to adapt to a new scenario and to try to build another type of right-wing politics that is much more moderate, that is much more closer to, for example, the path followed by Angela Merkel in Germany, which means defending the welfare state and at the same time trying to impose certain liberal reforms, but trying to have like a sort of center-right character. And I think that the right is very divided at the moment between these two different opportunities. So the opportunity of radicalization, so defending the status quo, or the other opportunity of trying to adapt to this new scenario. And my feeling is that it's going to be growingly difficult for the right to stay together, because we are seeing growing tensions between these two different factions. And my feeling is that it's very difficult they will able to stay together. It might be that in the long term they continue to govern because they're holding the executive office at the moment and they will try to solve some of the problems. But I do think that the mid and long term, there is no chance that they can keep together. Third and last point, before I hope that Julieta can also join us later on, and this is about the situation of the left. And I do think that the problem for the left is similar to the problem of the right, but in another sense. The left is already divided. I think that's a key difference. The right so far has been able to stay together. In fact, they control executive office, and the left started a process of internal division and conflict much earlier. And the key problem that I think is that I don't see that, at least in the short term, there is a possibility that the left will be able to stay together and form a common platform. And the reason for that is twofold. I think that the left in Chile has a problem in terms of a generational problem. And so one of the issues that is dividing the left is that there is a young group of politicians that are building the new parties, so our type of Podemos, so to say, that has a deep conflict with the old left, so the old socialist party, so to say, and there is no chemistry, so to put, between this younger generation and the older generation. And this is a first line of conflict that I think it's very difficult to solve in the short term. And the second, it's a programmatic problem. I do think that within the left, there are still big debates to be solved about which type of social contract Chile needs for the future. So there are some forces that are very progressive and want to have a welfare state like the Scandinavian model, whereas there are others that want to have a much milder version of the welfare state, even like the liberal Anglo-Saxon version of that, like in Australia or New Zealand. So and these are two very different types of social contracts. And I don't think that, again, in the short term, the left is going to be able to solve these two problems. And this is why I do think that for the Constituent Assembly, again, we'll have a big, not big, but we'll start seeing more and more polarization, because these debates within the left and within the right are going to be very present during this constituent process. And I think that already talked for 10 minutes, so I leave it there, and I hope that Julieta can join us then.
Thank you very much, Cristóbal, for your time. We've had some issues connecting Julieta, so we're going to use old technology, a phone, to connect her, and she's going to plug in to us. So I just want to again tell you who Julieta is. She is an associate professor at Universidad Católica in Chile, and she is also a member and a coordinator of Red de Politólogas. Julieta, I mean, above all of those things, was very involved in the design of this Constitutional Assembly, particularly in the gender parity rules. So with no further ado, Julieta, I hope you can hear me, and the floor is yours.
I hear you well, Javier. Thank you very much. I think we are ready for that joke. How many PhD you need to connect someone to Teams? But I would like to thank you anyway, you and the Queen Mary Latin American Network and the School of Politics and International Relations for the invitation to participate in this conversation. I hope it can work this way. So let's give it a try. This has been an eventful year worldwide, but I believe more so in Chile. Javier and Cristóbal were 10 protesters took the streets in Chile over a year ago. These protests were mostly spontaneous and inorganic, but peaceful mass demonstrations coincided with a wave of violence that left more of like 60 subway stations set on fire, destruction of street signs, fires in supermarkets, looting to stores. The repression of the protests, however, did not distinguish between crime and protesters, leaving behind human rights violations. So just to put you in context of how the scale of all the political parties will represent to leave this decision in the hands of the citizen was a way of acknowledging the prevailing discontent of representation and the demands for other forms of participation or political involvement that were exposed in the mobilization. The constitutional change, I believe, is also perceived as necessary to advance with a deeper reform agenda, as the current constitution made several or maybe most reforms of this neoliberal model unconstitutional. As you know, the plebiscite was scheduled for April, but it was postponed to October due to the coronavirus pandemic. And finally, over 2 weeks ago, Chile approved the constitutional change by a large margin of the vote, and even by a larger margin opted for a constitutional convention elected for the sole purpose of drafting a new constitution. I believe the plebiscite was an important event. There was an important turnout, especially if we take into account the suppression of voters infected with coronavirus, the pandemic outbreak itself, but also the low participation rates during the last decade in Chile. The final results were closer to 80% of the voters choosing a new constitution and a constitutional assembly that will be the first in the world to be integrated by a balanced proportion of men and women. And that was the part of the process that we were involved as Red de Politólogas, as the network of women political scientists in Latin America, in the parliamentary discussion. But we were supposed to talk today about hopes and uncertainties. What are the hopes and uncertainties that remain for the constitutional process? Well, let's start with the uncertainties, since there are plenty of them. I believe the turnout for the plebiscite was relevant, not only because of the whole environment, pandemic, everything, but also because it showed a different pattern of participation. Districts of working class sectors participated more than they used to, as well as younger people. So I believe that one first uncertainty or question ahead is, will we see the confirmation of this as a trend for the election of conventional delegates in April? Or we will witness a regression to the mean of a skewed participation by class and age, meaning like higher socioeconomic sectors participating more and older people participating more. Well, I don't know how optimistic we can be for April. Conventional delegates elections will be concurrent with local and the first regional governor elections. And these elections, unlike the plebiscite, like people will have to vote for candidates and parties this time. And this is not something many people are really looking forward to. Also, these concurrent elections are, I believe, like a nightmare for analysts who like to predict, for instance, like cocktail effects. They are a nightmare because of the exceptional characteristics of a delegates election, plus the inaugural regional elections, and also local contests in which, thanks to recently enacted term limits reforms, several districts will not have incumbents on ballots and will be open races. So the three contests that we will have in April have a high level of uncertainty by themselves. So we don't know what voters would prioritize. Would they vote for local issues, for regional issues, for constitutional mandates? It's really difficult to know beforehand, and it will probably be also difficult to know after the election. And also, what about the list for delegates? Will the opposition be able to agree on united lists? Will the government ally with the extreme right party that is not part of the governing coalition? One of the few things that we do know about the process or the constitutional process that is starting in April is that the new articles need to be approved by 2/3 of the delegates. So the number of lists running in mostly small-sized districts is extremely relevant to know. For instance, it depends on whether the right is going to be able to control at least 1/3 of the convention and to veto radical changes. You could be seeing me now. I make like air commas for radical, but we don't know that today. Also, that 80% that voted for the constitutional change is not all opposition votes. Many important leaders from the right campaigned for the approval option. It is difficult to estimate how many of these voters will prefer center-right and conservative delegates. We can safely assume that the 20% who voted against the change will vote conservative. But if there's not a unified list on the right, who will they support? The government or the extreme right? And we haven't even started talking about the actual substantive content of the Constitution. Everything seems to be up in the air. Presidential system, we keep it or not? Should we switch to a parliamentary system? What about human rights treaties? These treaties will get constitutional rank, women's rights. Will the citizenry know which list stands for which alternative? I think this is, for me, like the biggest uncertainty. And this is all very uncertain, at least as today. So having mentioned just a few of these uncertainties ahead, I would like to underline the importance of the hopes. I hope, but I believe I'm not alone in hope in this, that the constitutional road ahead and that reshaping state-society relations in a way that all sectors have a stake in the system, regardless of temporary wins and losses, that the resulting institutional settings and rights and duties are not perceived as biased, as beneficial only for the few instead of the many. I would say that that's my main hope and the biggest hope that I have for this process. Thanks, Javier.
Thank you very much, Julieta, and thank you for joining us, even in very low-tech conditions that we're going through. So thank you also to Cristóbal again for his words. And I'm now going to open up the questions. So if you want to ask questions, you can use the Q&A function on Teams. And I'll have my own questions as well in case we don't get many. So I will start with one on the party system. And it's particularly interesting because we've seen what's going on in Peru this week. If for those of you unfamiliar with South American politics, the president from Peru, Martín Vizcarra, was deposed by Congress in a surprise decision. And one of the many things that people claim is that Peru is going through an ongoing and quite long-term political crisis in terms of political parties. And a lot of people are using that example to compare what is happening in Chile, where political parties are also dealing with low reputation and with a huge rejection from the population. So I want to ask Cristóbal first on this one. What do you think that this process will do to the political parties in Chile, to the party system in general? And do you think there is any reason to be hopeful or uncertain about what's going to happen in the future with political parties?
Thanks, Javier. This is a tough question because you are asking me to do predictions under a period of time in which there is a lot of uncertainty. So this means that all the predictions that we can do and based on certain assumptions, and we know that these assumptions are very shaky. Nevertheless, I think that what it's important to keep in mind is that Chile had a long period of stability from the 1990 onwards in terms of the political system. And part of the reason for that has to do with the binominal electoral system. We had an electoral system that is very peculiar that, to make a long story short, facilitated the construction of a sort of a two-party system. So we didn't have a two-party system, but we had two big coalitions. And within these coalitions, we had a right-wing coalition and a left-wing coalition. And the electoral system facilitated the existence of that type of model. But we know that that sort of binominal system changed during the last government of Michelle Bachelet, and we have now a much more representative or proportional electoral system. And one of the consequences of that is that we are moving towards a multi-party system. Nevertheless, as Julieta was also telling us, we don't know how the new constitution is going to look like. So I do suppose, this is my assumption, that we will keep the sort of electoral system that was established before, maybe with a couple of changes, but we will continue to have a sort of proportional electoral system. And if this is true, my expectation is that Chile will move towards a much more multi-party system than it has been in the past. And this probably means that in the right-wing bloc, we probably will see this growing tension that I mentioned before between the radical faction and the moderate faction will crystallize in the formation of two different types of right-wing parties. So a populist radical right party or a far right party, I expect that can be consolidated in Chile, that will be able to move to get between 10 to 15% of the vote. And we will have a sort of moderate liberal right-wing party that will get more votes, 20 to 25. But the big question is also what will happen on the left, because the left, as I mentioned before, is deeply divided, and it's not divided only in two different sectors. In fact, there are many different sectors. We still have like the old Communist Party that I don't think that it's willing to change its brand and make something like a coalition with other parties. So it will continue to exist, probably mobilize 5 to 7, 8% of the vote, but we'll also have other left-wing parties. So to make a long story short, I think that in the future we'll have in Chile much more multi-party system, but it doesn't mean necessarily that we'll have like the sort of Peruvian model in which we'll have a lot of different parties that will come and go. I do think that a couple of parties will stabilize over time, and this will give some stability to the country. But again, I think there's still a lot of uncertainty about how things are going to move forward.
All right, thank you very much, Cristóbal. I'm sorry for asking you to predict things. I know we like to explain, not predict things usually. I'm gonna move to Julieta now. I'm gonna take you away from gender questions, which I'm pretty sure you've had a lot, and move you to another area of your specialty, which is subnational representation. One of the, I mean, we discussed briefly, both of you discussed briefly the differences in terms of how the vote is distributed across the space. But I would also like to ask you about what do you envision in terms of the design of this constitution with regards to subnational territories and territorial representation?
Well, as you already spoiled the audience, I'm definitely in favor of a more decentralized constitution. But I think, or the way I see the problem is that I believe that the problem with Chile right now is not the presidential system per se, but the Chilean type of presidentialism. So I could strip powers from the president to concentrate power from the presidency to Congress. And you don't need to switch to a parliamentary system to do that. So at least I envision it as goals, as objectives. I think we need to share power in Chile. So we need to move to a constitution that shares rather than concentrate power. And by concentration, I mean in the presidency, but also in the national government. I think that the COVID crisis in Chile showed the shortcomings of excessive centralization. And if the problem is in part the concentration of power in the president, it is also the centralization of power in the national government and in Santiago. A more inclusive distribution of power needs to include, for me, or what I believe, it's a great deal of decentralization in terms of authority, resources, and responsibilities as well. And I think to the regional level, because there are so many municipalities, that I think that the regional level would be like more contained way to think about decentralization. The direct election of regional governors, for me, is the first step. There are many people here in Chile that complain that we shouldn't be voting for governors that do not have the responsibilities nor the resources. But I believe, and I strongly believe that comparative evidence points that elective officials will have a stake in a successful decentralization process that grants really more subnational autonomy, like real subnational autonomy, to regional governments. So these elective governors, these legitimate elected governors, would start probably collective action and bargaining deals with the national government, or maybe even with the Constitutional Convention in Chile, to push for a more decentralized state. I really believe that one of the problems in the current constitution is centralization of power, and that means functionally in the presidency and territorially in Santiago. And I think that needs to be changed, and from what I gathered, the first step to have the political decentralization first, as the first step, I think it's good news for those who really believe that regions need to be able to pinpoint the regional problems and think their own regional solutions to them, rather than waiting for Santiago to do the decision-making process.
Thanks a lot, Julieta. We have questions coming in, so I'm gonna scrap my list of questions. I'm gonna go through them. This is for both of you. So I'm gonna turn it to Cristóbal first, and then Julieta. And the question is, what exactly do Chile want from the new constitution? So we talk about political parties and decentralization, but if you have to explain to our audience, many of them probably are not familiar, or as familiar as we are on Chilean politics, what are people expecting from this new constitution? Cristóbal?
Thanks, Javier. I think that of course, there are many different things that Chileans want from the new constitution, but I do think that in the debate on the street, so to say, it's not a very abstract one. I think it has like a sort of symbolic dimension. And I think what Chileans really want is a new social contract. And when I'm speaking about a new social contract, means the way in which power is distributed within society, the way in which people are treated, and also it has a lot to do with issues related to inequality. So probably if you ask someone on the street, do you think that the health system should be that type, or the pension system should be that type or not? People don't necessarily have like strong opinions about that, but they do have the feeling that the current model is not working properly. So they want to change that sort of model. Changing the model doesn't mean, as some people argue, that Chileans want to have Cuba or Venezuela or North Korea. I think that Chileans want a sort of moderate welfare state. That's what they want. So their model, so to be, it's being a bit more like Europe in the sense of having like a social safety net that works. So in this sense, I think what Chileans expect from this new constitution is a new social contract that allows for the development of a sort of a mild social democratic model. That's my own interpretation. And to build that sort of a social democratic model, there are many things that this constitution should allow to do that the current constitution doesn't allow to do. Some of these issues are related to the territory that Julieta was mentioning before, but it has a lot to do also to the role that the state should play in the economy and to what extent the state should have certain prerogatives that now it doesn't have.
Thank you very much, Cristóbal. Julieta, what do you think that the Chileans want from the constitution?
I completely agree with Cristóbal. It's very difficult to think like a general width. I'm more like Schumpeterian in that. I don't believe that such a thing exists. So the 80% that voted for approval, they want more state involvement in the economy. That does not mean going to a state-controlled economy, but they want, I would say, a change in the balance of power between the state and the market. And if we change that, I believe there's going to be like a new, I don't know if put it like a desire or hope for a new dignity for all. This is kind of tangentially related to the question, but I was thinking during last year, like fires to the subway stations and a lot of destruction of public property, that didn't surprise me at all, because what you are taught in Chile is to despise public things. Public education, public health, that's bad. You're supposed to be able to afford private education and private health. So I believe that what people are wanting is more like a reinvigoration of public thing space, both territorially and functionally, and that means that the state should be able to tame some of negative experiences, and that means, and I agree with Cristóbal, go to North Korean or Cuban or Venezuelan model. So it's more moderate than some people think. But then you have like other parts of Chileans that are the ones that voted against that they don't want probably like nothing to change. And I think that's problematic, but they are a minority. So I believe that people really want a new, more inclusive social pact that includes indigenous people, women, like people with disabilities, sexual dissidences, and I believe that really the Constitutional Convention should strive to get that everyone has a voice in a way about the new future for Chile, the new institutions and new rights that are going to be respected by the state mostly in Chile.
Okay, and let me pick in that, because we have a few questions asking about representation of different groups, particularly indigenous groups, and some questions about gender representation, which we discussed briefly on the issue of gender parity in the electoral system. But can you maybe give us a quick or brief update of how do you see how do you see the inclusion of different groups, particularly, as I said, indigenous groups and women in the constitutional process?
Well, the indigenous group, we're still waiting for that decision. When we started with this process in last November, our project included like gender parity, independence, and reserved seats for indigenous people in Chile. And then in Congress, they decided to separate the three issues. So we end up working only on gender parity. But I think that was a mistake in a way, because now we are like a year after that, and we still don't have a decision about how indigenous people are going to be present, because that means that, like, descriptive representation, but how they're going to be present in the Constitutional Convention. And it's been like a pretty rough discussion. The opposition and government, they don't see eye to eye on this issue, and I'm really looking forward to this to solve in a way that the Constitutional Convention end up being definitely more inclusive with indigenous people. But really, as today, we don't know. Gender is more like a tricky issue, because we are not a minority, we are the majority of the population. Even if the literature talks about women's interests, like, we are really diverse. I would say that especially in Chile, where conservative women are a strong force in politics, and they have been probably even like before leftist women were present in the formal institutions. So I think in gender parity, it's much more difficult to think what kind of outcomes you will see from a constitution, from a conventional constitution that has gender parity. I tend to believe that it is necessary to have a more feminist constitution, but it's definitely not sufficient to have a more feminist constitution. I do believe that inclusiveness and diversity in the Constitutional Convention would bring like new issues to the table, and would bring also new perspectives on all issues. So it's definitely better to have women there, but we don't have to think that by having women we will have only feminist women or leftist women. That won't happen. We will have like a huge array of different interests of women, also cut by class, by religion, by ethnicity, and those are different things that also separate women, especially in regard to women's interests. And in such a conservative society as Chile, regarding to sexual rights and reproductive rights. So I'm optimistic. I think it's important to have the representation in the convention that we are in the society, but I don't believe that is sufficient for having a feminist constitution.
Thank you. We're running out of time, so I'm gonna take two questions, and I'm gonna drop both of them to you. And I'm gonna start with Cristóbal. You can choose which one to answer and for how long, and then Julieta. So the first question is about there are several questions about the participatory processes during the Constitutional Convention. So we've talked about the history of the movement, how it came through, what happened in the referendum, what's going to happen, or briefly what's going to happen during the convention, but what's going to happen with the movement, the people that mobilized, the people that hit the streets to actually push for a new constitution. How are they going to be involved throughout the process? Or how do you think that it would be a reasonable way of getting them involved in the process? And the second question, it's about Chile's role as an international player. So one of our attendees is saying that Chile has a reputation for being a significant global player, assuming the size of the country and the relevance. So do you think that there is a reason for concern here, in that Chile is somewhere turning inwards and looking internally, and maybe how this can lead into the debates about the role of Chile, and also the attitudes among Chilean population about international issues? So I'll start with Cristóbal.
Okay, thank you very much, Javier. I will talk briefly about the two issues. I begin with the last one, and it's about the international dimension of that. I do think that Chile has played a big role in the international arena, although it's a small country, mainly because of two reasons. One, it's this political stability and long-term economic development, and this is why many countries have seen Chile as a sort of role model. But I think what the whole process tells us now is that this idea that Chile is a role model, it's a complicated one, because it's true that Chile has been going through a process of economic modernization, but at the same time, it's very true that the sort of economic model that Chile implemented during the dictatorship and has been not deeply changed during the 90s and the 2000s, it's not working very well for a big chunk of the population. So, and this is why I do think that what people really want is a sort of a safety net that is non-existent at the moment, and a sort of the rebuilding of the social contract. So if this process of constitutional change works in a proper way, I think this is a big sign for the world that there is a possibility of changing things through institutional mechanisms to rebuild the social contract. And it could be the case, again, if this process works in a good way, that Chile might become a role model again, but in the sense that it will show to the world a way of changing the existing model in a pacific way, despite the issues that we have had with violence. But this is an open question that will depend on to what extent that sort of constitutional process will work properly or not. But I don't think, again, that Chileans want to build North Korea or Venezuela or whatever. So Chileans are still very open-minded. They still support multilateral institutions. So I don't expect in this sense that Chile will move into another type of thinking in this sense, but want to have like more social democratic institutions. And very shortly about the participatory process during the convention, again, it's difficult to know how it's going to work because we don't know yet how this entity is going to work, but my feeling is social movements will not disappear. I think social movements have been very relevant in Chile in the last 10 to 15 years, and not because now we have a constituent assembly debating the new social contract, people will go to home and will watch TV. I think we'll have protests in the coming months, I expect that. And the social movement will try to put pressure not only to the Congress to legislate certain issues, but also to the constituent assembly. This is particularly true if the constituent assembly, we have like a strong right-wing bloc that tries to diminish the possibility of undertaking structural reform. And if this happens, my feeling is that the social movement will become very strong next year and will go to the street telling to the Constituent Assembly that Chileans want deeper reforms, but this depends a lot on the electoral results of the Constituent Assembly.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Cristóbal. Julieta, what do you think?
I believe social movements learned from the transition to democracy, that I feel that they were left with the impression that they were relevant to trigger the transition to democracy. They were very active during the dictatorship, and then when the transition to democracy came, the civilian government said, okay, fine, now we have democracy, you can go home and stop doing politics, then politics is like for us. And I think social movement learned that lesson, and that's why they are pushing for more participatory mechanisms within the Constitutional Convention. It's like we are not happy with just electing the delegates, and that is, and now you have the 155 or the number of delegates that end up being after the reserve seats, like deciding by themselves. We want to be part of that. And I believe the Constitutional Convention, and we don't know now, but they should take that demand, that claim into account, and design some kind of participatory mechanism for the social organizations to have a say in the process, during the process, and not just electing the delegates. And I believe social movements learned that. That is not that, okay, fine, now we are drafting the new constitution, you can go back home, and I agree with Cristóbal that won't happen. Like, people will want to keep intervening in politics, not only through the election of delegates and not only through political parties, but also through collective action and grassroots action, and of course also think tanks and lobbies, not only on the left, also on the right. I think that would be more like a staple of the future of politics in Chile. I hope we will see more like involvement in politics and engagement than we've seen before. Regarding the international role of Chile, I think that Chile can become a new role model. Well, we will be the first country with a constitution drafted by with gender parity. So I think that that's a pretty big one. But also I believe that for the region, for Latin America, this kind of change in Chile maybe would open more like an era of no more bilateral negotiations. I'm thinking mostly in regards to the United States, but more like a multilateral negotiation with the rest of the Latin American countries vis-a-vis the central states in the economy. So I think that is something that could happen after the new constitution is drafted if the state is gaining like more leverage on the market than it had before. And again, that doesn't mean to go to a state-led economy. It means only to have like a more social, democratic type of state.
Okay. Well, we are out of time now, and I just want to first apologize for the questions that being left unanswered, and thank you for sending them, for your participation. I wanted to take also a minute to thank both speakers, to Cristóbal Rovira Kaltwasser and Julieta Suárez-Cao. Thank you very much to both of you for your time, for your words, for your knowledge and your wisdom. Hopefully, for those of you viewing this, also it was an insightful talk about the situation in Chile. Hopefully, it'll also bring more discussion about this topic as things start to move in the country. So keep tuned to us. On that note, the Queen Mary Latin American Network and the School of Politics and International Relations organize several events throughout the year, and because we are now in the COVID era, we can do all these events online. I promise you that most of them work much better than this one in terms of getting everyone on the camera. So if you would like to keep informed about this, please leave your email on the Q&A box. That way we can then take it, and because I'm telling you this, it hopefully fulfills GDPR concerns. On that note, thank you very much. Thank you again to the School of Politics and International Relations and the Queen Mary Latin American Network for putting all the infrastructure for this, to our speakers, and to the actually quite big audience we had today. Thank you.